No cars, no planes, and it's pretty tough to row a boat around the country. These were the thoughts of the United States government when they decided to make a railroad across the country. It all looked simple on paper. They would start in Nebraska and move westward, and start a second line in California and move eastward. The line starting in California would be called the Central Pacific, and the line starting in Nebraska would be called the Union Pacific. Both sets of tracks were set to meet somewhere in the central United States. Little did the government know, building a railroad across the country was no simple task. It involves lots of preparation such as surveying, grading, track laying, and spiking. In the east, the Union Pacific got off to a slow start, but with a new leader, Civil War General Dodge, and 10,000 men, all looking for new jobs and lives in the west, the process got underway quickly. In the west, General Crocker, the leader of the Central Pacific, had found an easy source of men. More than 12 Chinese men jumped at the opportunity of work in a new country. Workers had many hardships on their journeys, sleeping in portable tent cities with poor living conditions. Although living was hard for the workers, the Native Americans were the ones who took the largest toll. Railroads tore up land in the Great Plains, wiping out herds of buffalo as they went. Through the hardships, the two lines managed to meet on May 10, 1869, in Utah. A golden spike was put in place to acknowledge the town, cities, mail, and supplies that would now be available across the country.
Once railroads reached the plains, ranchers and cowboys could make a living much easier. Before, it was very hard to transport cattle ranch to ranch. The demand for cattle was very high in the eastern cities, and ranchers could make extreme profits from selling beef. However, life on the plains wasn't always easy. Angry Indians and even with trains transporting cattle was difficult. Soon after railroads were introduced, some Americans took part in a slaughter that still haunts Americans past today. Bands of people would travel killing thousands of buffalo that skins and bones then were shipped to the east for sale. By doing this, the Indians had no more food and were forced to live on reservations. Now that the cattle could be transported much easier, nearly 5 million cows were shipped town to town over the course of 20 years. But the cow trade came to an icy halt in the winter of 1886. Farmers recall it as hell on earth, but cold. It was so cold, entire herds of cattle froze to death. However, ranchers and cowboys were not the only people living on the Great Plains.
Homesteaders were made of many different kinds of people, such as farmers and ranchers, European immigrants, slaves, Russians. The homesteaders would move to the Great Plains for two reasons: cheap land and religious freedom. By the 1900s, more than 500,000 homesteaders had moved to the Great Plains. The homesteaders struggled with many things like turning the grasslands into grain fields, watering their lands because the rain was so unreliable. The grasshoppers would eat their plants, and they had very few trees for wood. The homesteaders had to adapt to their surroundings. Their solutions were to use sod instead of wood. They would use windmills to pump the underground water. They would plow deeper to get the moist soil, and they invented a type of winter wheat. Although living on the plains was hard, homesteaders had to adapt to their environment, and they did that well.